For nearly half a century, 42 Native American schoolchildren were simply gone. No funerals, no headlines, just silence. In the spring of 1948, they boarded a yellow bus outside a residential school in rural Minnesota and vanished. Families were told it was an accident, that the bus had likely crashed in a snowstorm. But there was no wreckage, no search, no closure. Then, in the winter of 1995, a sonar crew scanning Lake Huron discovered something unimaginable buried deep beneath the ice, a perfectly preserved school bus. Inside, the truth had waited in silence, sealed for decades. But as investigators begin to unearth what really happened, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a secret. One buried so deep it took frozen time to bring it back. In January of 1995, the lake looked like glass, thick with ice, silent under the weight of years. A state sonar crew was doing what they always did this time of year, charting the depths of Lake Huron for future hydropower planning. Just routine. Until the screen showed something unnatural. It was shaped like a box. Long, rounded edges. The crew first thought it might be an old fishing boat. But when Greg Hollander, the sonar tech, zoomed in and enhanced the scan, every man on that boat fell silent. There, perfectly preserved beneath 70 feet of solid ice and sediment, was a full-sized yellow school bus. No one spoke for a long time. By the next morning, the lake was taped off. A temporary operations tent had gone up. Divers, forensic teams, state officials, all arrived in careful procession. What they pulled up from the ice wasn't just a bus, it was a sealed tomb. The windows were intact, but fogged dark with time. Inside, they found bones, small, still dressed in wool coats and thin uniforms. A rusted lunch pail, a broken hair clip, a child's mitten frozen in place, fingers curled around nothing. One of the side windows had something etched into it, barely visible through the frost. A name, Elise Blackcrow. The story hit national news, but it was already old news for some. The native families from Red Pines Reservation knew this bus. They'd waited for it to come back 47 years ago. And it never had. In April of 1948, that same bus had left St. Nicholas Indian Boarding School with 42 Native American children inside. It was supposed to be a reward trip, a rare outing to a nearby spring festival in St. Helene. The school said it was a privilege earned after months of hard discipline. What they didn't say, at least not out loud, was that these children hadn't seen their families in months. That they were being punished for speaking their own language, that they were being broken down and reshaped. The driver was a man named Walter Brome, middle-aged, reclusive, and rarely seen outside the grounds. He didn't speak to the children, just turned the ignition and drove. That bus left at 9:15 a.m. on April 11th. It never arrived. The school issued a statement days later, claiming the bus likely crashed somewhere on the rural backroads. A storm had moved in that afternoon. Snow covered the tracks. Search efforts were minimal. One article ran in the local paper, buried deep between ads and classifieds. There was no public outcry, no official investigation, and so the silence began. But one person never let it go. Mabel Blackcrow, now in her 60s, had watched her little sister Elise board that bus. She remembered the moment like it was frozen in her mind. Elise waving from the window, cheeks pressed to the glass, braids bouncing with each lurch of the tires. Then gone. No word, no funeral. Just a quiet knock from a priest telling them to keep faith. Mabel had kept more than that. She kept records, clippings, letters returned unopened. She joined other families in protest over the decades, but doors stayed shut. Voices were muffled. And year after year, her sister's name was slowly erased from even the places that were supposed to remember. Now, standing at the edge of Lake Heron, Elise had finally come back, carved into rusted steel and remembered in bone. Among the items pulled from the bus was something odd, a small cloth bundle hidden beneath a rear seat. Inside, a notebook, pages damp but legible, childlike handwriting, a list of names, a few drawings, and then one entry that froze even the seasoned officers on site. Sister B came that night. She was crying. She said we had to leave now. She told Walter to drive to the big lake. No one knew what it meant, but someone needed to find out. That someone turned out to be a young journalist named Nia Whitaker, Ojibwe on her mother's side, stubborn on both. She'd grown up hearing bits of the story, always in hushed tones, always ending with a shrug or a sigh. But now it was real. The ice had given up a secret, and Nia had no intention of letting it be buried again. She began to dig into old school files, court documents, parish letters, land records, anything that might explain why a school bus full of children had been deliberately hidden under a lake for nearly half a century. What she found wasn't answers. Not yet. What she found was missing files, mysterious resignations, a driver who vanished days after the bus, a nun who transferred far away, never to be heard from again, a stretch of road that no longer existed on maps, and survivors like Mabel whose grief had turned into quiet rage. No one ever looked for the bus because no one wanted it found, but now the truth was rising, piece by frozen piece, and Nia was about to learn that some stories don't stay buried. They wait. Snow still blanketed the back roads of Windridge in 1995, the same way it had in 1948. Only now, time had added silence. Long, cold silence. As if the land itself had agreed to forget. But Nia Whitaker didn't forget. She had grown up hearing stories whispered through kitchen doors and over funeral fires. Stories about the lost bus no one ever looked for. Now, the whispers were back, and louder. She stood near the edge of Lake Heron, staring out at the hole cut through the ice. Divers were still working shifts in freezing conditions, bringing up remains carefully catalogued and sealed in temperature-controlled bags. She didn't look at those. Not yet. She focused on something else. A rusted metal lunchbox, its red paint barely visible beneath the corrosion. On the side, scratched in shaky letters, was a name, T. Red Feather. Nia had seen that name before. Weeks ago, when she was reviewing archival lists from St. Nicholas Indian Boarding School, a class register from early 1948, room 6B, Red Feather, Timothy. Age 12. She pulled out the copy from her satchel and stared at it. There were 22 names on that page. 10 of them matched the remains recovered so far. The problem was, that same class list no longer existed in the official school files. Not in the church records, not in the county database. Only in one damaged microfiche reel at the Duluth Historical Society, mislabeled and nearly discarded. Someone had tried to erase these children, but they'd missed a corner. That night, Nia drove to Red Pines Reservation. She had an address, Lot 17, North Creek Trailer Park. Mabel Blackcrow opened the door slowly, leaning on a cane, her long gray braid falling over one shoulder. She looked smaller in person, thinner than the fire she carried in her letters and protests for decades. She didn't speak at first, just looked at Nia, then nodded once and stepped aside. Inside, the walls were filled with photos, some faded, others laminated. Children in uniform standing straight, unsmiling. A few baby pictures with names underneath, all written in careful, neat Ojibwe. At the center of the wall, a black and white photo of two girls. One was clearly Mabel, the other her little sister Elise. "She carved her name in the window frame before leaving," Mabel finally said, voice low. "Didn't want to go, said something felt wrong." Naya sat quietly, letting the words hang. She was only 9, loved birds, used to make little ones from cedar bark. Her fingers trembled slightly. I think she knew. Naya pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside was the carved bird, pulled from the bundle of notebook pages. Mabel touched it through the plastic, and for a long moment said nothing. Then her shoulders shook once. Then again. "I told them," she whispered, over and over. No one listened. Nia had listened, and she wasn't going to stop now. The next day, she requested official access to school bus route logs from 1948, but was told the county did not retain transportation records from that period. Curious. She tried the Department of Indian Affairs. Nothing. Finally, she contacted an old retired priest who once worked at St. Nicholas, Father Kearns. He refused to speak at first, but after learning what had been found in the lake, he agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet cafe near the edge of town. Kearns was in his 80s, hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were clear and wary. "There were things we didn't ask questions about," he said, stirring his tea with a trembling spoon. "It wasn't our place. The church ran the school, yes, but certain decisions came from higher or from outside." Outside? The bureau, state officials. Sometimes strangers came, suits, no names. They'd talk to the headmistress behind closed doors. "Did you know Sister Bernadine? She was strict, cold, but not unfeeling. Something changed in her that spring. She started locking her office at all hours, and one day, she vanished." Nia leaned in. "Vanished? No goodbye, no reassignment, just gone. The nun said she'd been called away, but I saw the ledger. She didn't sign out, just disappeared." He looked around, voice dropping lower. "They found her rosary near the lake. I never told anyone. Didn't seem like they wanted it found." That night, Naya marked the date in her notebook. April 14th, 1948. Sister Bernadine disappears. The bus had vanished 3 days before. Too many things didn't line up. She drove the supposed route the bus would have taken from the school to St. Helene. There was one narrow back road that veered off near the old lumber mill, closer to the lake. The road no longer appeared on current maps. Overgrown, forgotten. But there it was, a faint dirt path under melting snow. Naya stopped her car and walked. Trees closed in from both sides, no sounds, just wind and the soft crunch of her boots. And then, at a clearing, tire tracks. Faint, fossilized impressions in the soil beneath the thawing top layer. She photographed them, measured them. It was possible they'd survived all these years under snow, protected by layers of pine needles and cold. She kept walking until she saw it. A rusted sign half swallowed by bark. Private property, no trespassing, 1951. The date jumped out. 3 years after the bus vanished. Who bought this land? And why post a sign so deep in the forest? Nia returned to the county office and requested land purchase records. After hours of digging, she found it. In 1951, the plot had been quietly sold to a now defunct entity named Silver Creek Development Corp. No known business, no activity, just a one-time land purchase and silence. She kept flipping until her hand froze. One of the listed board members was a name she had seen before. Walter Brome, the bus driver. The man who had supposedly died in an accident just weeks after the disappearance, or so the original school statement had said. Except, according to this, he was alive 3 years later, buying land, near the lake where the bus was just found. Something was very, very wrong. She copied everything. Every file, every receipt, every signature. She didn't know what Silver Creek really was, but she knew one thing. The man, who was supposed to be dead, had something to hide. And the lake had only told half the story. The deeper Nia went, the more the town around her seemed to stiffen. At first, people spoke in polite tones, offering clipped answers, vague recollections. But once she mentioned the name Walter Brome, the air changed. Doors closed a little quicker. Voices dropped. A former school secretary she had scheduled to meet canceled last minute. No explanation. A man at the diner asked if she was one of those bus diggers, and then muttered something about stirring ghosts better left alone. But ghosts don't leave children under ice. Nia knew she needed someone who had worked close to the school, someone on the fringes who saw without being seen. She drove out to the old Veterans Assisted Living Facility on County Line Road. There, in room 214, lived a man named Howard Linka. He had been the maintenance man at St. Nicholas from 1945 until its closure in the early 70s. He was 89 now, partially blind, sharp as ever. At first, he didn't remember her name, but when she mentioned the bus, his eyes shifted. "I remember that day," he said, voice rasping with time. April snow. Heavy. Too heavy for that trip, I thought. I told Sister Bernadine it wasn't safe. Did she respond? She didn't answer, just nodded, looked distracted, like she wasn't really there. He paused, then leaned closer. I saw the kids get on, all dressed up, little coats, braided hair. They thought it was a festival trip. But Walt, he wasn't himself. Nia straightened. "What do you mean?" "Usually calm. That morning he was sweating, kept checking the rear tires, patted something in his coat like he was nervous. When they drove off, he didn't wave like he always did." Howard pulled open a drawer and handed her a creased envelope. "I found this the next day, in the garage, behind the breaker box. Didn't know what to do with it." Inside was a stained page, yellowed with age, an inspection sheet. Bus number was 17. Scheduled route. Canceled new entry. Handwritten. Special instructions via logging road. Pickup for adults. Authorization BS. Nia stared at the initials. BS. Bernadine St. Clair. Why would she authorize an alternate route with 4 adults on board? 4 adults? She asked. Howard shrugged. There was talk, back then, that someone was smuggling a staff member off campus, but I never knew who. She left with the document clutched in her hand. Later that evening, Nia sat in the county records building, sifting through property ledgers again. She cross-referenced Silver Creek Development Corp. With building permits, tax records, even burial permits. What she found didn't make sense. In 1952, the land adjacent to Lake Heron was listed under ecological preservation, barring access. In 1953, the surrounding acres were absorbed by the church under a legal proxy, a move not registered until a full year after it occurred. There were no trails, no markers, no structures, and no access, unless you already knew where the road was. Her phone buzzed. A call from a contact in St. Helene she had interviewed days earlier, an elderly woman named Ruth Halverson, who had once worked in the archives of the parish. "I looked through the sacrament logs, just like you asked," Ruth said. "I didn't find any funerals or burials from April 48, but I did find something odd." She paused. "There's a page missing." Nia frowned. "From where?" "From the school's April logbook, the page that would have covered April 10th through 12th. Torn clean out." Another silence. "And there's something else," Ruth said. "You asked about Walter Brome's death record?" "Yeah?" "There isn't one, at least not in Minnesota. No obituary, no grave." Nia's pulse spiked. "Nothing at all?" Well, Ruth hesitated. There's a Brome in Missouri, same birth year, similar name, Walter S. Brome, died in 1993, retired building contractor, wife, no kids. Guess where he lived? Where? Near Table Rock Lake. Another lake. Nia booked her ticket to Missouri the next morning. She arrived in the small, humid town of Taneyville 2 days later. It smelled like pine and diesel and distant thunder. She found the property easily, a quiet farmhouse surrounded by trees. The woman who answered the door looked startled. "I'm sorry to bother you," Nia said gently. "Did your husband go by the name Walter Brome?" The woman narrowed her eyes. "He did, passed 2 years ago." Nia held out a photo, a scanned image from the St. Nicholas 1947 yearbook. Walter, standing near bust of 17, hands folded behind his back. The woman's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. That's him, that's Walt. But that picture, that's not Missouri." Nia nodded slowly. "No, that's Minnesota, from 1947. The woman trembled. "He told me he used to work in Oregon, said he had an accident and had to start over. Never talked about it again." "Did he ever mention a bus or a school?" She shook her head, then hesitated. "There was one night, back in the 80s, he had too much whiskey, woke up screaming, kept yelling something. They were just kids, Bernie, they were just kids. I didn't know what it meant. Bernie, short for Bernadine." That night, Nia sat in her motel room, the Missouri air thick around her. She stared at the notebook page she'd recovered from the bus, the child's handwriting, the carved bird, the final entry. She said we had to go now, not to tell anyone, just a lake and quiet. She read it again. This time, her mind filled in the silence. Not to tell anyone, just a lake and silence forever. Someone gave the order, someone wanted the voices stopped, and someone made sure the road to the truth stayed hidden for 47 years, until now. The drive back from Missouri was long, but the silence in Nia's car was louder than any storm. She kept thinking about the woman's words, just the lake, and quiet forever. What had really happened that night? Who else had known? And why had Walter Brome disappeared, only to resurface decades later, pretending to be someone else? The clues were stacking up, but they were still scattered, like pieces of a puzzle just out of reach. Something crucial was being kept hidden, and Nia wasn't going to stop until she found it. The ice hadn't been broken for nothing. She arrived back in Duluth late at night and went straight to the library. The sound of her keys echoed in the empty building as she headed for the archival room. She had a hunch, a feeling that something had been left in plain sight, waiting for her to notice. At first, there was nothing new in the parish records. Nothing in the bus schedules or the maintenance logs she had already reviewed. But then her eyes landed on an old manila folder in the corner of a dusty shelf, buried under several boxes of unrelated files. The label on the folder read, "Incident Reports, St. Nicholas Boarding School, 1948. She pulled it down, fingers trembling slightly. The folder felt heavier than it should. Inside were several crumpled papers, most of them faded with age. She skimmed through them, noting a series of reports about minor incidents at the school, students misbehaving, an accident in the workshop, an argument between staff members. But at the bottom of the stack was one paper that wasn't like the others. It was a detailed report signed by Sister Bernadine herself. The words were shaky, as if written in haste. Bus route altered, special permission. Given for off-route travel to Lake Heron. No prior notice. Unauthorized stop. Confirmed pickup of 4 individuals, 2 men, 2 women. Identification unknown. There it was. The first real confirmation that the route had been changed that day. But the reason for the stop was still unclear, and who were these 4 people? Nia stared at the report, her heart pounding. This was the moment everything shifted. Someone had ordered this. Someone higher up had wanted this to happen. To erase something. She copied the report and left the library, knowing she couldn't sit still any longer. She had to find those 4 people. She had to understand why they'd been picked up at the edge of a logging road. She had to know what happened in those last moments before the bus was driven straight into the lake. Her next stop was the town hall. She didn't need to ask for permission. The records were public. After an hour of combing through building permits and land deeds, Nia finally found the name she was looking for. It was on a deed for a plot of land adjacent to the lake, sold in 1951 to a private development company. The buyers' names were listed, but one of them stood out: William S. Pierce. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. She went to the courthouse the next day and found a personal file for William Pierce, a man who had lived in the area long before the land deal. According to the file, he had died in 1965 under mysterious circumstances. There were no details about his death, only a note that his business dealings had been irregular. In fact, his company, which was linked to land developments in multiple states, had gone bankrupt in the early 1960s. No family members had come forward to claim his estate. Nia felt the air grow thick with something she couldn't explain. Pierce had vanished from the records, but there had been a connection, a link between him and the events surrounding the school. He had been involved somehow, maybe as a business partner, maybe as an investor. But there was one thing Nia was sure of. He had to know something about what happened to that bus. Nia's next step was to track down Pierce's surviving associates, but she hit a dead end. People who had worked with him were either dead, moved away, or unwilling to speak. The trail went cold. But she didn't give up. One name kept resurfacing in the documents: Clarence Abernathy, an accountant who had worked for Pierce in the 1950s. She found his grave just outside the town, a small headstone marked with only a few words. When she visited the site, she noticed something strange. The date of death seemed off, a full year earlier than what had been reported in the records. She decided to follow the lead anyway. Maybe Abernathy's surviving family still lived in town. The next day, Nia found himself sitting across from Abernathy's niece, a quiet woman in her late 70s named Laura. She had lived in the area all her life and knew the stories of the town's past. "Yes, Clarence worked with Pierce," she said, as if reading Nia's thoughts. "He wasn't a big talker, but I remember one thing he said that stuck with me. He told me there was something wrong with the way the company handled its investments in the 50s. He said they got involved with shady people with too much power. He was scared, really scared." Did he ever mention what those people were involved in? "Only once. He said it had to do with, well, I'm not sure. He was going to meet with someone about it, but before he could tell anyone, he got sick, fast, real fast." Laura paused, wiping a tear from her eye. "He died that year, cancer, they said, but it was too quick. I always wondered if it had something to do with whatever he saw, whatever he knew." Nia thanked Laura and left, feeling the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way she hadn't anticipated. Clarence Abernathy had known something, and William Pierce had been part of a much larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the quiet town of Windridge. Nia knew she was close now. There were only a few more people left to talk to, a few more secrets hidden deep in the past. But every step she took brought her closer to an answer, and every answer only led to more questions. She was about to uncover the truth, but she had no idea how deep this conspiracy went. Nia sat in her car, parked at the edge of Lake Heron, staring out at the same frozen waters that had once held the answers. The ice had started to thaw, but something about the scene felt still, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for her to figure out what had been buried beneath its surface. She hadn't expected to be here today. Not yet. But the phone call from Laura Abernathy's niece had changed things. Laura had mentioned one last name. A name that had been absent from all the records. A name that had been buried under layers of secrecy. Gerald Quinn. Quinn had been Pierce's business partner. He had also been the one person who had never fully disappeared. There were rumors that Quinn had left town in the early 1960s, but no one really knew where he went. Naya's gut told her that Quinn knew everything. Everything about the land deal, about the bus, about the people who had been involved. The address Nia had tracked down was old, but it led her to a remote house on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a veil of overgrown trees. The house was quiet, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years. She knocked, twice, no answer. But then a faint shuffle behind the door. She tried again. "Mr. Quinn," she called, her voice steady, despite the tension building in her chest. After a moment, the door creaked open. The man standing there was older than she had expected. His face was lined with age, hair thinned and graying, but his eyes were sharp. They seemed to take in everything, and everyone, with a kind of quiet calculation. "You must be Nia Whitaker," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've been expecting you." Nia blinked, taken aback. "You've been expecting me?" "I knew someone would come eventually. I knew the truth wouldn't stay buried forever." Nia stepped inside, and Quinn led her into a small, dimly lit living room. The smell of old wood and cigarette smoke filled the air. On the table were stacks of yellowed papers, records, files, and photographs, all carefully stacked and organized. "Why didn't you come forward all these years?" Nia asked, sitting across from him. Quinn took a long breath, leaning back in his chair. He didn't speak for a while. Nia waited, letting the silence stretch between them. "They told me it was better if I stayed quiet," he said finally, his eyes flickering to the window. "Pierce. He wasn't the only one who wanted things covered up. There were people much higher up the chain who wanted to make sure nothing ever came of that bus. If I'd said anything, they would have ruined me. My family. I couldn't risk it." "So you just stayed quiet?" Nia asked, feeling the weight of his words settle in her stomach. "You let those children be erased from history?" Quinn flinched, his eyes flashing with something like guilt. "I didn't have a choice. They promised me protection. They promised my family safety." Nia leaned forward. "Who were they?" He hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, he reached for one of the old papers on the table and slid it across to her. "This is the list of names I have. People who were involved, people who made sure the bus never made it to St. Helene, people who ordered the cover-up." Nia looked down at the paper. It was a list of names, none of them familiar to her. Except one. Father Thomas Alden. The name sent a cold shiver down her spine. Father Alden had been a priest at St. Nicholas during the time of the disappearance. He had been one of the last people to see the children before they left. And, as far as Nia knew, he had been one of the first to push the accident narrative when the bus went missing. "That name," Quinn said quietly, watching her closely. "Alden was involved in all of it. He was the one who coordinated with Pierce and the others. He gave the order to take the children off the bus route and into the lake." Nia stared at the name, her heart racing. But why? Why did they have to die? Quinn leaned back, rubbing his eyes. It wasn't about killing them. It was about making them disappear. They were liabilities. They had seen too much. They knew too much about what was happening at that school. It wasn't just abuse, Nia. It was something darker, something worse. Nia's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Quinn looked at her, his gaze hard. "I'm saying that the children were part of something bigger. Something connected to the land, to the people who owned it. They were never meant to be educated, never meant to be part of society. They were meant to be erased, and when it looked like they might speak out, that's when they had to be silenced." Nia's mind spun. She had known it was a cover-up, but this was bigger than she had ever imagined. These children had been part of something systemic, something tied to land and power, something buried in silence for decades. "Do you know where Alden is now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts crashing in her mind. Quinn nodded slowly. "He's dead, died in the 70s. But he had a record. He was part of the system that tried to control those kids, tried to take everything away from them. And they weren't the only ones. They were just the first to be erased." Nia stood, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. "I have to find out what happened. I have to make sure this truth is finally told." Quinn watched her as she gathered the papers and stood up. "You won't stop, will you?" he said, almost like a warning. "No," Nia said quietly. "I won't stop." The days blurred together as Nia immersed herself in the web of documents and interviews she had gathered. The more she dug, the deeper the rot seemed to run. Each piece of the puzzle she uncovered only raised more questions. Who were the powerful people behind the church's decisions? What was the connection to the land, to the school, to the children? She sat in the dimly lit corner of her apartment, surrounded by maps, photos, and files, trying to make sense of the names and dates. And then it hit her. The church wasn't just complicit. The church had orchestrated it. The land deals, the forced assimilation, the cover-up of the bus's disappearance. It was all part of a bigger plan, one that aimed to control, to suppress, and to erase. Nia pulled up the records she had retrieved from Father Alden's early years. She had found his name on the church's financial ledgers. Small transactions, bribes, and financial support linked to Silver Creek Development Corp., the same company that had bought land adjacent to Lake Heron in 1951, the same company that Walter Brome had been involved with after the bus incident. But the true depth of Alden's involvement came from a letter she had found, tucked away in the same old file. The letter, dated 1949, was written to Bishop Samuel Carrington, one of the highest-ranking officials in the church at the time. The handwriting was elegant, meticulous. "Bishop Carrington, we have initiated the necessary steps to handle the situation regarding the children and their families. As per our previous discussions, the land acquisition has been secured, and the school is to remain undisturbed. The children will be removed from public sight, and their disappearance will be attributed to an accident. The remaining children will be dispersed to families of our choosing. We cannot afford any disruptions to our land interests. The investments we have made require full control of the property. In light of the situation, I believe we should proceed with the plan to move the children to the designated location. If necessary, we can make further adjustments to the timing of their departure, but this must remain confidential. Father Thomas Alden." The letter sent a cold rush through Nia. She had known that the children were seen as a threat to the land deals, to the political influence of those behind the residential schools. But now it was clear. Their disappearance wasn't just about erasing a story. It was about land, control, and wealth. The bus had been part of a systematic effort to silence anyone who posed a danger to the church and the powerful figures who benefited from their land transactions. Nia sat back, overwhelmed by the implications of what she had just read. But there was more. A name stood out in the letter. A name she'd seen before, Bishop Carrington. She recognized it from one of the documents she had found earlier, a ledger that had been hidden within the church's archives. Carrington had been involved in securing the land deal for Silver Creek. He had been in direct communication with the very people who ensured that the children were kept silent. This wasn't just a cover-up of a missing bus. This was a conspiracy to erase an entire generation of children, their culture and their families, all in the name of profit and power. Nia knew she had to confront this head-on. She couldn't allow this truth to be buried again. But she also knew the risks were higher now. She was up against the church, against men who had built their power on the very systems that had silenced the voices of those most vulnerable. But she wasn't alone. The families of the children had waited too long for justice. Nia had already seen the way the truth had sparked something in Mabel Blackcrow. It had ignited something deep inside her, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. She had seen the way Mabel had touched Elise's carved bird, the weight of a lifetime of grief finally being acknowledged. The next step was clear. Nia needed to find Bishop Carrington. She had to track him down, confront him with the evidence she had, and finally get the answers. She wasn't sure what she'd find, but she was certain of one thing. The truth had been hidden for far too long. The next morning, Nia packed her things and drove to the last known address for Bishop Carrington, a mansion just outside the city, now a historic site for the church. As she pulled up to the gates, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mabel. "I'm with you. Whatever happens, we'll make them listen." The words gave Nia strength. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The mansion loomed before her, its tall windows reflecting the sun. But beneath its beauty, Nia could feel the weight of history, a history of secrets, of lives erased, of children lost to time. She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding in her chest. The door opened slowly, and a tall man in his late 70s stood before her. His hair was silver now, his face lined with age and experience. His gaze, though, was sharp, calculating. This was a man who had spent decades building his power, maintaining control, and keeping secrets buried beneath layers of authority. "Miss Whitaker, I presume," Bishop Carrington said, his voice deep and measured. "I was expecting you." Nia didn't hesitate. "I need answers." Carrington raised an eyebrow, stepping back to allow her inside. The mansion's interior was grand, adorned with heavy velvet curtains, ornate furniture, and paintings that seemed to judge her as she stepped through the door. Everything about the place screamed old money, old power, and old secrets. They sat in a sitting room, its grand windows looking out over manicured gardens. Nia placed the folder of documents in front of him, the letter from Father Alden, the land acquisition records, and the names that had been buried for decades. "I know what you've done," Nia said, her voice calm but firm. "I know about the children, about the bus, about how you and others like you used your power to bury the truth." Carrington didn't flinch. Instead, he stared at the folder for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Miss Whitaker." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Nia shot back. "You've spent your life erasing people, erasing families. You've used your position in the church to silence those who would speak out." The bishop leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "What you don't understand is that the church doesn't just deal in faith. It deals in survival. And sometimes survival requires sacrifices." Nia felt a chill run through her. "Sacrifices?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You're talking about children. Innocent children who were taken from their families and driven into a frozen lake. You didn't just erase their story. You erased their lives. Why?" Carrington's eyes grew colder, and for the first time, Nia saw a flicker of something darker in them, Not fear, but something else. Those children weren't meant to be part of society, he said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. They were a threat to the order we had worked so hard to establish. They were a symbol of resistance, of defiance against everything we had worked to create. Naya's heart raced. So you killed them, just to maintain power? Carrington smiled faintly, as if he were speaking to a child who didn't understand the complexities of the world. Not killed, Miss Whitaker. Removed, controlled. Their families had no place in the future we were building. The land around this town was valuable. It was always going to be. But the native population, their culture, their history, that was a stain. It needed to be erased, and they were the first step. But the rest, he trailed off, his fingers tapping the armrest of his chair. The rest would follow. Nia clenched her fists, trying to hold back the surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm her. You took those children. You made sure they disappeared. But you're wrong about one thing. They did matter. They do matter. And I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did. Carrington's smile faded, replaced by something far colder. You don't understand, Miss Whitaker. People like you are nothing more than pawns. You think you're uncovering a great truth. But what you're really doing is exposing yourself to forces much larger than you can comprehend. There are consequences for what you're trying to do. You can't just walk away from something like this. Nia didn't blink. I don't need to walk away. I'm not afraid of you, or of what you've built here. Carrington stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. You should be. The tension in the room was palpable, but Nia didn't back down. She stared him in the eye, knowing that the confrontation she had been preparing for had finally come. The weight of history was in that room, pushing against her, trying to crush her resolve, but Nia had come too far to let it go now. Why don't you just admit it? She asked, her voice steady. You used the church, you used the land, you used those children as pawns in a game you've been playing for decades. The only reason you're here now is because the truth is finally coming out. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Carrington didn't say anything for a long moment. He turned toward the window, his back to Nia. You're young, he said, almost to himself. You think this is about truth, but it's about control. Always has been. I've already won, Nia said quietly, standing up to face him. The truth always wins. You can't hide behind your walls forever. Carrington turned back to her, his expression now one of quiet resignation. We'll see, he said softly. We'll see. Nia left the mansion with a sense of finality. Bishop Carrington hadn't broken, but she could see it in his eyes. The walls were cracking. The truth was rising, and no matter how hard they tried to bury it, it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. She knew that Carrington wouldn't be the last to try and stop her. There were still more to confront, more truths to uncover, but the pieces were finally coming together. Nia wasn't done, not by a long shot. The bus had been a symbol, a beginning, but it wasn't the end. There were more voices to be heard, more families to be honored, and justice to be served. And now, she had what she needed. The final push was coming. Nia sat at her desk, her mind racing as she sifted through the last of the documents she had collected. The pieces were finally fitting together, but something still gnawed at her. She had confronted Bishop Carrington. She had found the hidden records. But there was something more, something deeper, something that tied everything together: the land. She had spent hours researching the land deals and property acquisitions linked to Silver Creek Development Corp. What she hadn't realized until now was just how far the church's influence stretched. This wasn't just about silencing children. This was about land, control, and the systematic erasure of an entire people. She spread out the maps across her desk. Every location, every transaction, every name had led back to the same core: the church, the government, and a select few businessmen who had used the native children as pawns in a larger game. The children had been a threat, yes, but more than that, they had been the key to something bigger. It wasn't just about the land around Lake Heron. It was about resource control: timber, minerals, water rights. The church and its affiliates had been systematically acquiring vast tracts of land, often under the guise of charity or religious missions, but in reality they were setting up a network of holdings that spanned states. The children were the first sacrifice in a much larger plan to secure these lands that had long belonged to the native communities. As Nia pored over the documents, a name kept appearing: Lyle Turner. Turner had been a high-ranking businessman involved in the early stages of Silver Creek's development. What caught Nia's attention was his connection to Father Alden. They had worked together on land deals, using the church's influence to broker shady contracts. Turner's name was also tied to a series of confidential agreements, documents that had been sealed for decades, signed by prominent church officials, businessmen, and politicians. Nia pulled up an old news article from the 1950s. Lyle Turner had been involved in a controversial land grab in the late 1940s, after which his company had rapidly expanded its holdings. The article mentioned a suspicious fire that had destroyed a warehouse full of church documents in 1948, the same year the children disappeared. The fire had been deemed accidental, but the timing was too perfect. The church had lost vital records, including land deeds, inventory logs, and financial papers. No one had ever questioned it. Nia's pulse quickened. The children hadn't just been a threat to the church's power. They had been a threat to a corporate empire. Turner and Alden had ensured that no one would interfere with their plans. The children's disappearance had been the perfect smokescreen. She dug deeper into Turner's history. The more she uncovered, the more she saw the connections: to the church, to the land, and to a network of powerful figures who had orchestrated everything from behind closed doors. Nia finally found a record that made her stomach twist. It was a sealed letter from Lyle Turner to Father Alden, dated April 5, 1948, just days before the bus left St. Nicholas. Father Alden, we are in agreement that the removal of these children is necessary for the future of our investments. The land we've acquired is too valuable to be left in the hands of the native people, and their presence here would only complicate matters. You are to proceed as planned. The bus will be driven into the lake, and their disappearance will be seen as a tragic accident. This will be the last step in securing our claim on the land. Once this is handled, we can proceed with the development of the property. Lyle Turner. Nia felt a rush of disbelief and anger. This wasn't just about a few rogue figures acting without consequence. This was a systematic conspiracy to erase entire communities and replace them with development that would bring in millions. The children had been nothing more than an obstacle, a threat to the financial future of men like Lyle Turner and Father Alden. This was the final piece. The children hadn't just been silenced, they had been sacrificed. The truth was more horrifying than she had imagined. It wasn't just the church. It was a network of corporations, politicians, and businessmen who had been using their power to push through deals at any cost. And they had gotten away with it for decades. Nia knew she had to expose this. The full truth, the names, the motivations, everything. She had enough evidence to bring the case to the authorities. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed witnesses, testimonies, people who could speak to the corruption that had allowed this to continue. She thought of Mabel Blackcrow. She thought of the other families who had waited so long for answers. They had the right to know. They had the right to reclaim their history. Nia took a deep breath and picked up the phone. The first call was to a lawyer she had met a few weeks ago, someone who had been involved in civil rights cases related to Native communities. He needed to know about the land deals, the corruption, the church's involvement. The second call was to a local news outlet. It was time to go public. The world needed to know what had happened to those children, to their families, and to the land that had been stolen from them. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and late nights, but Nia was relentless. The stories began to surface, not just from the families but from whistleblowers, former employees of the church, and even a few politicians who had quietly acknowledged the land schemes over the years. The conspiracy was too large to ignore now. Nia's heart pounded as the final piece clicked into place. The truth was finally out. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. This was just the beginning. The morning of the press conference, Nia stood in front of the podium, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The room buzzed with reporters, their cameras trained on her, their pens poised to catch every word she would say. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, but now that it was finally here, the weight of it settled on her like an old burden. Heavy, suffocating, yet finally coming to a head. Behind her, the slides began to roll. Maps of the land acquisitions, images of the bus from 1948, and documents that had never seen the light of day until now. The room fell silent as the first image appeared on the screen. A photograph of the bus, its frozen windows staring back at them, as if time itself had held it hostage for all those years. Nia stepped forward, her voice steady as she spoke. For nearly 50 years, the truth about the disappearance of 42 Native children from the St. Nicholas Indian boarding school has been buried. We've been told it was an accident, a tragedy of nature, a storm that took these children from their families. But that story, the one we've all been told, is a lie. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. She could see the disbelief in the eyes of some of the reporters, the skepticism in others. But there was no turning back now. She had the facts. She had the names. The children were not lost. They were silenced, erased. This disappearance was not the result of an accident or nature's cruelty. It was the direct result of a coordinated effort to remove them from a system that sought to control, erase, and profit from their existence. She clicked the remote, and the next slide appeared. Lyle Turner's letter to Father Alden, detailing the plan to eliminate the children as a threat to their land interests. These documents, these letters, show that the children were seen as obstacles to something much larger. Something that went beyond the church, beyond the boarding school, and into the realm of corporate greed and power. The room was still, save for the sound of reporters typing furiously, trying to capture everything. Nia's heart raced, but she knew she was ready for this moment. It was the culmination of years of silence, years of pain. The church, in collusion with corporate interests, had a plan. They systematically erased the lives of these children in order to secure control over the land that rightfully belonged to their families. The bus, which was driven into Lake Heron, wasn't a mistake. It was the final step in a plan to remove the children from the equation, to remove a threat to the land that was worth millions. The room was still silent, the reporters absorbing the weight of her words. Nia could feel the tension in the air, the shift in the way the audience was beginning to perceive what she had uncovered. The land was valuable. Timber, minerals, and water rights were there for the taking. But these children, they were in the way, so they had to go. She clicked the remote again, and images of the sealed documents, the manipulated records, the hidden land deeds appeared on the screen. The evidence was undeniable. Father Alden, Bishop Carrington, and Lyle Turner were not just complicit in this. They were the orchestrators of it. They ensured that the children's disappearance was covered up. They erased the truth, manipulated the records, and forced families to believe a lie. The church, in its pursuit of power, sacrificed the most vulnerable. The journalists began to murmur, but Nia didn't stop. This was her moment. This was the reckoning. But it doesn't end here. The truth is finally out. The families of these children have waited decades for justice, and now the world knows what happened. The victims have names, the perpetrators have been identified, and it's time for accountability. The final slide appeared, a photograph of Mabel Blackcrow, standing tall, her face lined with years of grief, but also with a glimmer of hope. She had fought for this moment. She had waited for it. The fight isn't over. There will be legal battles. There will be investigations. But today, we take the first step toward justice for the children of St. Nicholas. Today, we start rebuilding what was stolen from their families. Today, we speak their names. Nia's voice shook slightly, but she stood tall. I will not stop until justice is served, and I will not let these children be forgotten. The room erupted in chaos as reporters shouted questions, pushing microphones toward her. But Nia didn't stay for the questions. She knew the media would take over now. She knew the story was too big for them to ignore. As she left the conference room, she felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but the truth had been spoken. It had been heard. And the world would never be the same again. The next few weeks were a blur of headlines, legal battles, and interviews. The names of those involved, Father Alden, Bishop Carrington, Lyle Turner, were broadcast across the country. Public opinion shifted. The church faced backlash. The corporate interests behind Silver Creek Development Corp. were put under scrutiny. For the first time, there was a real chance for justice. Mabel Blackcrow and the other families who had waited so long finally had a chance to grieve properly. And Nia, who had started this journey alone, now stood with them, a force for truth, for justice, for those who had been forgotten. But the journey wasn't over. Nia had uncovered the truth, but there were still others out there. People who had made sure the children were silenced, who had manipulated the system to get what they wanted, and they would answer for it. One by one. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. For the first time in decades, the families of the 42 children who had disappeared in 1948 finally had the chance to be heard. Mabel Blackcrow stood at the front, her face lined with the weight of years, but her posture was stronger than it had ever been. She wasn't alone now. She was surrounded by the voices of those who had waited for so long, the voices of the forgotten, the voices of the silenced. Nia sat in the back, watching as the trial unfolded. It had been a long, painful process to bring this to court. The church fought tooth and nail to suppress the truth, but the evidence was irrefutable. Lyle Turner's name had been dragged through the mud, Father Alden's corruption uncovered, and Bishop Carrington forced to answer for his role in orchestrating the cover-up. Silver Creek Development Corp. had been named in the proceedings, their land deal scrutinized under the light of public inquiry. And yet, as the trial progressed, Nia could see that the real work was just beginning. This wasn't just about bringing those responsible to justice. It was about something much deeper. It was about reconciliation. It was about acknowledging the pain, the trauma, the loss that had been buried for so long. The verdict came in, and the courtroom fell silent. We find the defendants guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The disappearance of the children of St. Nicholas was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of erasure, orchestrated by the church and its affiliates to conceal their corporate interests in the land surrounding Lake Heron. The judge's voice echoed in Nia's mind as the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the families who were celebrating. It was everyone who had fought for the truth to come to light. The guilty parties would face legal consequences. Bishop Carrington, Lyle Turner's estate, and others who had been complicit in the cover-up would be held accountable. Their names, once shielded by wealth and power, had finally been exposed. But even as the celebrations began, Naya knew the fight wasn't over. The system that had allowed this to happen had not been dismantled. There were still deep roots of corruption to untangle. There was still work to be done for the native communities, who had suffered for so long in silence. Nia stepped outside the courthouse, her mind whirling with the enormity of the moment. She had done it. She had uncovered the truth. But there was still so much more to do. Mabel Blackcrow was standing near the steps, her eyes filled with something Nia hadn't seen before. Not grief, not anger, but peace. "You did it," Mabel said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave us back our children." Nia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You gave them back. You never gave up. I just helped carry the weight for a little while." Mabel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But you brought them home." For the first time in her life, Mabel felt like her sister Elise and the other children were truly home. Their names had been spoken, their lives mattered. They had been erased for so long, but now they were alive in the stories being told, in the justice being served. The families began to gather, their voices rising in quiet celebration. But Naya stood back for a moment watching them. She knew that this victory was not just about what had happened in the courtroom. It was about the long, painful road of healing that lay ahead. The families had reclaimed their history, their dignity, their voices. But the scars ran deep. It would take time for the land to be returned, time for the families to find peace, time for the generations of trauma to be healed. But the first step had been taken. That night, the small town of Windridge held a memorial. The families gathered at Lake Heron, the place where the children had disappeared so many years ago. The water was calm now, a quiet reflection of the sky above. Mabel stood at the front, her hands held out in front of her as if reaching for something. Naya stood beside her, her heart full of quiet sorrow and gratitude. For a long time, the family said nothing. There were no words to fill the empty space left by those who had been lost. Instead, they simply stood together, honoring the lives of the children who had been taken from them. And then, slowly, they began to speak. Mabel's voice was steady as she whispered Elise's name. Then she spoke the names of the others. One by one, the families named their children, their loved ones, their lost ones. When the last name was spoken, there was a moment of profound silence. The names of the 42 children who had vanished were no longer a mystery. They were no longer forgotten. They were home. Nia stood quietly in the background, her heart full. The fight wasn't over, but tonight the world had changed. Tonight, justice had been served, and the past had finally been allowed to rest. As the families left the lake, walking side by side, Naya knew that she had done what she came here to do. She had helped bring the truth to light, and in doing so, she had helped bring the voices of those who were lost back into the world. They would never be forgotten again. This marked the end of the investigation, but the story of those children, of their families, of the justice that had been delayed for so long, would continue to echo in the hearts of everyone who had fought for them. The journey of healing, of rebuilding, had just begun. But now, at last, the truth had been spoken, and the world was forced to listen.